Natalia first, Natalia Rogach Alexander. She's lecturing here in philosophy. Her work specializes in political philosophy, philosophy of education, ethics, and American pragmatism. She's an early career fellow in philosophy. She received her PhD in philosophy from here, under him. It's all very local. And sorry? Oh, okay. This is her committee. Minus Axel, who's in Germany. But I remember Natalia as a student in the department, already very talented from an early age. And she's been obviously publishing a lot, and this is her publication of her book. And another publication includes Dewey on Democratic Education in the Cambridge Handbook of Democratic Education, and apparently is writing with Philip a piece on educating democratic character for moral politics and moral philosophy and politics. Our first speaker is going to be Philip Kitcher, who is a John Dewey Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Columbia. Got his BA from Cambridge, his PhD from Princeton. He taught in UC San Diego, University of Minnesota. He's the author of too many books to mention on all sorts of subjects, from philosophy of biology and science and mathematics and the role of science and society and naturalistic ethics. And then he crept into my field and wrote on Wagner's Ring and Joyce's Finnegan's Wake and Mann's Death in Venice. He's had all kinds of honorary positions, which are too numerous to mention. Our next speaker is Michelle Moody Adams, who's the Joseph Strauss Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory at Columbia. She served as Dean of Columbia College, Vice President for Undergraduate Education. She taught at Cornell. She was Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, Director of the Program on Ethics and Public Life. She taught at Wellesley, Rochester, Indiana, where you were also Associate Dean. Yeah, you've really been everywhere. She served as president of the Eastern Division of the APA and is a lifetime honorary fellow of Somerville College, Oxford, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. That's extremely impressive, and but we wouldn't expect anything less. And Stuart Firestein, finally, is the former chair of Columbia's Department of Biological Sciences, where his laboratory studies the vertebrate olfactory. I was trying to system, possibly the best chemical detector on the face of the planet, apparently. That you must have written that. Aside from its molecular detection capabilities, this olfactory system serves as a model for investigating general principles and mechanisms of signaling and perception in the brain. Sorry, the type here is so small, I can hardly see it. His laboratory seeks to answer the fundamental human question, not who am I, what do I know, but how do I smell? Do you mean how you yourself smell, or how you're able to smell? Again, there's a lot of ambiguities tonight. Okay. He's currently Professor of Biological Sciences and Provost Senior Faculty Teaching Scholar at Columbia University. That concludes the bio statements. We begin with Natalia, who will speak for 8 minutes, introducing her book on the enduring legacy of Dewey, and then we'll be followed by Philip, Michelle, and Stuart. Then we'll have discussion, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia, for this introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate it. It's lovely to see all of you. John Dewey is among the most famous philosophers of education of all time. But I argue that his best contributions to the field have never been fully appreciated. To be sure, plenty of books have been written about his progressive educational ideas. Active participation should replace passive absorption. Teachers should cater to each student's uniqueness. A superficial reading suggests a picture of Dewey as a kindly educational reformer who isn't a particularly deep or interesting philosopher. Active participation in the classroom is nice, but it isn't philosophically interesting. I argue that this superficial picture is wrong. Dewey's fame as an educational reformer is, of course, well-founded. But we cannot understand his quote-unquote progressive views on schooling apart from his overarching inquiry into human development in all spheres of life. No study to date has shown how this inquiry informed Dewey's work in other areas: political philosophy, aesthetics, metaphilosophy, connecting them in a coherent body of work that focuses on human growth. And yet, this was his most important contribution to philosophy, or so I argue. This book reveals a fresh portrait of Dewey as an educational theorist. It also offers a new perspective on a neglected field. Essential to the tradition I focus on is the broad enterprise of investigating and remaking the forces that shape who we become. Emphasizing this doesn't mean ignoring schooling. As Plato, Rousseau, Du Bois, and Dewey knew well, schooling shapes future generations. That's why they bothered to delve into the specifics of nursery practices, children's storytelling, and vocational training. Still, what lent these more concrete discussions philosophical depth, richness, and critical force were the various fundamental perspectives on human development that informed them. As Dewey once put it, philosophy of education is about reconnecting schooling to, quote, serious and thoughtful conceptions of life, end of quote. Seen through this lens, underappreciated aspects of the philosophical tradition come to light, revealing the outlines of an alternative canon that focuses on human development. Central to this canon is the conversation that spans millennia between philosophers who took education seriously. Plato and Rousseau were Dewey's explicit interlocutors on education, but other authors are equally important to this canon. When, in The Immortal Child, Du Bois connects reflections on the education of African Americans to a wider critique of racial oppression, when, in A Room of One's Own, Woolf criticizes women's unequal access to the conditions necessary for developing autonomy and creativity, they are making essential contributions to this canon. Like many other great philosophers, Dewey employed the past to serve his own philosophical agenda. One doesn't turn to Dewey for an unclouded view of the minutiae of Plato's arguments. Still, Dewey was a perceptive and original reader of the tradition. He was right on at least one point: the special importance of education to his interlocutors. Dewey was inspired by Plato and Rousseau because they, too, saw philosophy as a subject that seeks to investigate and facilitate human development and flourishing. He built on this insight to argue against the reigning view in philosophy that conceived of narrow, technical questions as paramount. Engaging with the past allowed him to create a platform from which to argue for a new way of doing philosophy, one that's relevant to solving the problems of the present. Why am I focusing on Dewey? He is important as a thinker who sought to modernize the ancient inquiry into human development and flourishing. Chapter 1, Philosophy and Education, shows how Dewey gave this inquiry a fresh start by drawing on historicism, evolutionary biology, and psychology, then a nascent field. Hegel, Darwin, and William James left an indelible mark on his thought. Taking them seriously meant that a simple return to the past was impossible. How should the ancient inquiry be continued today? How can this project be adapted to the challenges of modern industrial capitalist societies, to the problems of American democracy? Dewey tried to work out answers to these questions for the modern age. With this general picture in place, chapters 2, Democracy and Education, and 3, Art and Education, reveal the centrality of education to Dewey's political philosophy and aesthetics. They show how Dewey's focus on human development helped him reframe debates in these fields. They also show what we can learn from Dewey as we face current challenges, the failures of contemporary democracies, widespread drudgery, estrangement among individuals and groups. Chapter 4, Flourishing and Education, revisits the idea of an alternative canon that focuses on human development. Even the most wide-ranging and sympathetic reconstruction of Dewey's thought uncovers problems and gaps in his immense body of work that spans almost 100 years and 37 volumes. Dewey wasn't always right, but he's worth engaging with as the philosopher who provided the modern American answer to Plato's Republic.
Thank you very much, Natalia. It's a lovely summary of a terrific book. When Columbia University Press wrote to me saying, could we have one sentence for the publicity, I thought I would have the opportunity later on to say a bit more. But that sentence is all they put on the back. Actually, no, it's not even a sentence. It's just a phrase, a definitive study. So I want to start by saying why it's a definitive study. And this will recapitulate things that Natalia has just said. This is Dewey's most influential book. It is more read than any other book. It has made a difference to American education, and it's often these days much criticized, even in educational circles. But Natalia is absolutely right. There is this big problem that brings Dewey to talk about education in detail. He sees education and the structure of education as bearing on the most fundamental, the oldest philosophical problem. How do we live? And he approaches that, I think, in the double way that question is posed. How do I live as an individual, and how do we live as a group of individuals together? Both of these things are in Dewey's book, and it's a very rich philosophical book, and this book of Natalia's is a definitive study because it is, in a vast literature on Dewey's democracy and education, the first book that takes that seriously. So congratulations on that, Natalia. Central to it is an idea. What development does is not unfold a little self that's in there from the beginning, but it does something that enables this individual to grow. And the notion of growth is central. Now, as Natalia points out in her book, growth has biological origins. It has origins in the idea of an organism that is sometimes out of equilibrium with its environment. And part of growing is learning how to get back into equilibrium with a changing environment. And in that, growth generates capacities. And that growth comes about, and this is a very suggestive phrase she uses, as the result of a dialogue between the individual and society. Natalia has more to say about this than anybody has ever said before, but it's not enough. Natalia knows it's not enough. This concept of growth needs a little bit more unpacking, in fact, quite a lot more unpacking. And so what I want to do now is actually trespass on territory that Natalia's current work is exploring. I want to talk about what it is that we get from a process of growth. What makes something growth rather than malformation? I mean, just the mere fact that the infant changes is surely that doesn't necessarily amount to growth. All right, can we say more about this? I think we can. We start off with a biological organism, and it is in interaction with typically a fully mature caregiver. And that the early stages of the growth of a personality, a character, and a mind come from interactions with a caregiver or caregivers. They are inevitably shaped by the society in which that caregiver has grown up. And behind Dewey's treatment, I think, and here I defer to William James, who thought that John Stuart Mill was really the father of the pragmatist movement. I hear Mill's idea of the individual and individual development when he says the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way. He adds a rider to that. I'm not going to talk about that at the moment. So what Mill has in mind is the idea of us coming to a stage where we can make some kind of sense of what matters to us, what kinds of things we want to do, achieve, be, take part in, and what kind of person we want to be. And that is inevitably, it can never be as free as Mill or Kant or other Enlightenment figures might like it. It is inevitably constrained. And there's nothing, as it were, there at the beginning that we have to elicit and make fully explicit in the grown person. It's the dialogue that has to do the work. And that dialogue works, I think, by attention to the directions in which this developing organism is going, the kinds of predilections and interests it expresses, and an attempt to forward what seems most relevant and most important to the child as the child grows. And that, with luck, will produce an individual which, although not completely free, not having been presented with all possible options, for example, is nonetheless a growing being that has found something distinctively its own because of the way in which this dialogue has gone. That, I think, is the general approach that Dewey takes here. But he adds to Mill's account something which I think is important, that I think is actually tacit in On Liberty, although Mill doesn't express it very clearly there. And that is the idea that this individual's sense of itself and what is important in its life is part of a human tapestry, a human framework of projects with which it should somehow be in harmony. And this is where the democracy side of democracy and education really comes in. So the project that a million individual chooses ought to be one that fits within and contributes to other individual human projects. So Dewey sees us all as part of something much larger than ourselves, to which we contribute in our own way. And the experiences that give us most satisfaction and most joy, the kinds of experiences that Dewey thinks of as, real experiences, fulfilling experiences, those, I think, come from and contribute to this much larger human project. This is something which it's a theme that sounded later in more recent ethics and political philosophy by John Rawls in Theory of Justice and by Bernard Williams in some of his writings. And it comes to a head, I think, in a work that, as far as I know, Natalia doesn't cite. It's the very end of Dewey's Terry lectures on a common faith. And Dewey is a terrible writer. He's a really dreadful writer. I'm going to sort of say something in the spirit of Stuart Firestein. Dewey's prose has the smell of wet wool about it. It's just dreadful. But there is one place at which he's truly eloquent, and with this I will leave you. It's the end of a common faith. We who now live are parts of a humanity that extends into the remote past, a humanity that has interacted with nature. The things in civilization we most prize are not of ourselves. They exist by grace of the doings and sufferings of the continuous human community in which we are a link. Ours is the responsibility of conserving, transmitting, rectifying, and expanding the heritage of values we have received, that those who come after us may receive it more solid and secure, more widely accessible, and more generously shared than we have received it. That's what Dewey calls his common faith. Thank you.
Great. So I was drawn to philosophy by a sense of wonder in the world and by an unexpected joy arising from engaging with the best philosophical attempts to understand the world. Such reactions can be difficult to sustain in the current moment, so it's a mark of just how fantastic Natalia's book really is that rereading it for this panel helped me recover both the wonder and the joy. And it's not only because the book is elegantly written, but also because it helps the reader appreciate that Dewey's thought is a reliably rich source of wonder at the world and joy in the effort to make sense of it. Yet my comments today will pose a few questions about whether Dewey's philosophy of education was as successful as he hoped, and on three dimensions. First, shaping people for and by democracy, understanding how people are affected by encounters with art, and analyzing the conditions of social and political progress. Now, my worry about the first problem of shaping people for and by democracy isn't just a function of what Dewey actually said, but also of the ease with which some interpreters, both sympathetic and unsympathetic, seem able to attribute purposes to Dewey on the basis of things in texts that he did not support. So here I ask Natalia for her thoughts on why it's been so easy for some conservative critics to blame Dewey for what they take as a crisis of character in America and for what they view as a related hostility to national values that might be relevant to the shaping of character. Evidence of the crisis of character is said to include such phenomena as violence in schools, disrespect towards parents and elders, and rudeness and coarseness in the broader culture. But we know that what Dewey really wanted was, and here I quote Natalia, a thriving democratic culture, which enlarges the sensibility, sympathy, and intelligence of those who take part. So what features of Dewey's view could leave the impression that his recommended pedagogy must produce people who look so different from his hoped-for results? Might part of the explanation be Dewey's pragmatist account of values as phenomena which ultimately emerge only out of problem solving rather than framing it? If not, how can Dewey resist criticisms of his view of valuation as just uncomprehending caricature? Or do Dewey's pedagogical recommendations encourage intellectual and social anarchy, perhaps ceding too much authority and influence to student interests, both inside and outside of the classroom? As a child growing up near the University of Chicago, my own parents, themselves public school educators, denied my request to attend the university's laboratory school out of fears about this very possibility. Were their fears unfounded? Then there's the second part of the worry regarding how Dewey and principles shape people for democracy. To this day, some critics charge that Dewey was part of a progressivist, secular humanist cabal that gradually undermined what they call the foundations of the Republic. According to the American Family Association, for instance, the problem was Dewey's refusal to accept that American democracy just rests on certain self-evident moral truths. And I don't think we can simply dismiss the accusation as naive if Dewey just might be committed to the idea that what's valuable in the American experiment emerges only out of our efforts to solve problems we encounter trying to preserve it. As Natalia knows, I am deeply sympathetic to Dewey's conclusion in his 1939 Creative Democracy essay that the ideal of democracy is, and I quote, a freer, humane experience in which all share and to which all contribute. But can this marvelous conclusion be rendered consistent with Dewey's understanding of value? Now, my second worry builds in a somewhat briefer way on a concern raised in chapter 3 of Natalia's book on art and education. For if, as Natalia agrees, providing consolation is truly a central way in which the arts may contribute to well-being, what does this really mean for Dewey's claims about the relationship between aesthetic experience and growth? My problem here is not just that it may be misguided, as Natalia suggests, to try to subsume all aesthetic experience under one pattern. The problem is rather that when art consoles us, it almost always does so by generating a profound sense of our limitations and even seems to demand rejection of the meliorist optimism that defines Dewey's whole approach. As achingly beautiful as I find Strauss's Vier letzte Lieder, I have never experienced their beauty without a sense of human limitation and even ultimate powerlessness in the face of circumstance. So now my final concern focuses on Natalia's rich but somewhat compressed discussion, as Philip suggested, of Dewey's views on the connections between individuality and progress. And here I mean both individual and social. On the individual, Natalia writes that Dewey was not a simple-minded apologist for community as such, yet, though he recognized that we can find ourselves at odds with our surroundings, he still believed that personal growth requires social immersion through which we learn to draw, these are Natalia's words, to draw on our irreducible uniqueness to produce valuable communicable results that reflect constructive adjustment to the environment. But might the path to social progress be different? What if the willingness to stand apart, even to live with a profound sense of alienation from some communities of which one is a member, might be essential for cultivating the capacity to reflect critically on the community's underlying norms? George Katab once urged that we should understand what's morally admirable about Socrates, for instance, in terms of this very willingness to stand apart. I've in print extended the underlying idea to argue that all great moral visionaries and social reformers in human history, such figures as Socrates, Gandhi, King, Václav Havel, Nelson Mandela, that they've all been unafraid to stand apart in this way. And indeed, sometimes periods of isolating imprisonment, endured frankly by everybody on my list, proved to be pivotal in their development. They can be reformers, I've suggested, because they're not afraid to be alienated from the quotidian life of their communities and from structures of thought and feeling that might uncritically preserve injustice. So my final concern then is whether even the deeply thoughtful Dewey, who emerges from Natalia's very rich interpretation, could even acknowledge, let alone understand, that this is so. Thank you.
Thanks. First of all, let me thank you for this invitation. I'm still not sure what I'm doing here, but here I am from the Department of Biology. So in 1957, Hungarian scientist Albert Szent-Györgyi, who 20 years earlier had been awarded a Nobel Prize for his work on vitamin C and metabolism, stated that in a book, discovery consists of seeing what everybody has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. Because I'm in a room with philosophers, I should mention that he's actually paraphrasing something written 100 years earlier by Arthur Schopenhauer, who wrote, "The task is not so much to see what no one has yet seen, but rather to think what nobody has yet thought about what everybody sees." The Szent-Gorgi quote is usually the one that's used, however, because it's a little less contorted. In any case, this idea of seeing what everybody has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought, I believe, is precisely what Natalia has done in this marvelous little book. She has seen the same John Dewey we have all been looking at for decades and opened new vistas and channels of thought about his work, showing him to be not just a kindly kindergarten teacher, but a deep and important philosophical thinker. I'm not actually sure Dewey wouldn't be a little surprised himself, but another story. So this wholly new perspective on Dewey arrived for me at a very propitious moment because I had become particularly interested in science education, not only K through 12, but all the way through undergraduate, and not only for science majors, but non-science majors as well. I did have the pleasure, as noted earlier, of serving on Natalia's thesis committee several years ago. And of course, this book comes out of that work, or part of it. Around the same time, I'd become interested in a movement among philosophers of science and some scientists to revive the pragmatist philosophy in science. In particular, the pragmatist interest, I think, in uncertainty and unpredictability had become increasingly attractive. So historically, I think I'm right about this, the pragmatists were working sort of in an interesting period right between Darwin and Einstein. And although those two names may serve as markers, the ideas behind evolution and relativity were kind of in the air, as it were. I had thought the recognition of chance and randomness in so much of the natural world was mostly the work of Charles Peirce, who coined the term pragmatism as the one actual working scientist among the founding group of himself, William James, Dewey, of course, maybe Chauncey Wright and Holmes, if you think. Excuse me. But in any case, reading Natalia's book and having had several discussions with her, I have come to realize how critical Dewey's thinking in this area was, and that he was not simply a school reformer, not that that would be such a terrible thing, but it developed a deep commitment to uncertainty, not only as a philosophical view, but as a centerpiece of his educational program, which, as Natalia has demonstrated, I think, very forcefully in this book, were in fact inseparable. In fact, I believe one could reasonably make the case that Dewey was most responsible for the systematization of pragmatism, largely through the architecture of his educational proposals. So I'd like to spend some of my time here talking about the importance of uncertainty in Dewey's work, an area that Natalia touches on here and there, but is really not the centerpiece of her book. But I do this because it was through her work on Dewey in this book and in numerous, I'm sure for her, painful conversations in which he introduced me to his strongly held ideas about uncertainty and his pragmatic and more systematic commitment to uncertainty reflected in his beliefs about education, which was the filter or even the instrument, I guess you could say, as Natalia so cogently recognized, that he used for so much of his philosophical thinking. So not only are these critical ideas, uncertainty and chance, not only are these critical ideas in modern science, where uncertainty and irreducible complexity is slowly being understood as the rule, not the exception, replacing the old and cherished ideas of a deterministic universe run by immutable, if presumably discoverable, laws. The thing is, these revolutionary ideas have to also be translated into our curricula, into our very way of educating our students and ourselves. Of course, I have to make here the obligatory statement that this is all the more true now that we are in the era of AI, but I'm going to leave that for later because I'm sure it will come up in the discussion. So I'll leave that here. Dewey, I think, extended Peirce's ideas about chance and randomness and uncertainty into a deeper and curiously more optimistic, I'll come back to that in a bit, view that finally permeated much, if not all, of his thinking in a different way than Peirce's more theoretical and to some extent methodological interests. For Dewey, uncertainty, it seemed to me, was the very fabric of the universe. It was not something to be avoided or worried over, but rather utilized, understood, and appreciated for the possibilities it provided, as opposed to those immutable laws that left very little wiggle room for things like free will, agency, not to mention surprise. So somewhat unpredictably, and therefore perhaps ironically, Dewey has become as modern as the new fields of chaos theory and complexity science. That's unexpected. Indeed, one of Dewey's most famous books, The Quest for Certainty, cited several times in Natalia's book, emphasizes his dislike of certainty as leading to what he called spectator knowledge, a kind of brand of knowledge or education in which we just accumulate true facts that largely confirm what's already believed. This, of course, he believed leads to intellectual passivity and eventually to civic passivity, and I guess eventually to the demise of democracy, but that's for Natalia's book to tell you about. The importance here for me is that we continue to teach science and possibly other subjects in a mostly 19th century framework of determinism. I gave a talk recently at Penn just a couple of months ago, and a student stood up, raised his hand, stood up, and wanted to comment that he felt his science courses were more history than science. I think he's right, I'm ashamed to say. So Dewey worried over this notion of spectator knowledge, not only as a false view of the world, but because it permeated educational practices where facts become final, experiments confirm rather than explore, and probability is just a statistical technique that stands in for deterministic laws of which we're currently ignorant. Dewey, on the other hand, I think would have students confront outstanding problems, understand that conclusions are provisional, that revision is a victory, and perhaps most importantly, because we put such an emphasis these days on statistics, that probability expresses degrees of what he termed warranted assertability, as opposed to some sort of convergence on a timeless truth, and that those probabilities are themselves dynamic. Uncertainty then is not something to eliminate, but rather to navigate. For Dewey, probability is what rationality looks like in a dynamic, evolving, changing world. I think Dewey's calls for learning as a continuing lifelong occupation may sound like a platitude until you recognize that in the unfinished, constantly evolving universe that Dewey so clearly saw, learning must also be an unfinished and evolving process. Dewey was an optimist, I believe, in that he saw this uncertainty as a field of possibility. His program was not to make school more fun, but to make it less factually burdensome and more dynamic, to reflect the universal realities of chance and uncertainty. If we are today especially concerned about mis- and disinformation and the ability of our fellow citizens, not to mention ourselves, to discriminate them from real information, which, by the way, is always more uncertain than pseudo types of information, which is always certain, then Dewey is showing us both the philosophical and the pragmatic path for achieving this. We should be listening with Natalia's ears. Thanks.
Thank you all for these wonderfully rich comments. I'll have a lot to think about after this panel. Well, as a Dewey scholar, I'll try to reply on Dewey's behalf to these comments, but as an independent philosopher, I'll tell you that I hear many of your frustrations with his program. I do not think he had all the answers. I don't think he was always right. But as a scholar, one has to be as charitable as possible to the thinker one interprets. So I'll inhabit his shoes and try to answer on his behalf. Let me first, in fact, I'll go in reverse order, starting with Stuart's comments on uncertainty. So I think, Stuart, you're completely right that for Dewey, uncertainty was the fabric of the universe, as you put it, and that this mindset that embraced rather than try to filter out uncertainty, this mindset that was comfortable with the provisional, fallible character of all our hypotheses, of all our knowledge, was really fundamental to the way he saw philosophy and the way he saw, in fact, the democratic character. For him, being too certain that you were right was a sure sign that you were not open to the kind of growth and the kind of learning that he saw as fundamental to both, I think, education in the classroom and also democratic life. So thank you for this. I think it really illuminates this fundamental part of the mindset that was necessary for growth for Dewey. So growth may sound like a platitude. I mean, we always talk about growth in so many different areas, and it just it sounds kind of self-helpy. You might be frustrated and think that Dewey is kind of shallow on this. But actually, I think he had a fairly rich account of the higher order habits or character traits one had to have in order to be able to continue growing as a human being throughout one's lifespan. And certainly this comfort with uncertainty, open-mindedness, but also willingness to listen to other human beings with sympathy and understanding in the democratic public sphere was very important to him. And this is where this connects to the concerns raised by Michelle. Michelle, I really appreciate the forceful criticisms of Dewey. I love them. So let me reply to the first one. Let's see, the hostility to national values, undermining the foundation of the republic. Okay, great. So, well, it depends. I suppose Dewey might reply, it depends what takes the foundation of the republic to be. So he really had, I think, a fairly rich and substantive conception of what the democratic ethos is. I don't think it was thin. I don't think it was anything goes. I don't think it was whichever way the winds take us politically. I actually think he did have a really thick ethical view of what constitutes a genuinely flourishing democratic life. And I think he sort of read, this connects to the sympathy point I was making earlier, fundamentally involving human beings in genuinely sympathetic, humane relationships where they really treat one another with dignity, respect, and mutual understanding. And I think that thick ethical conception is really at the heart of the democratic way of life. And that's the foundation of the republic for him. And I don't know, maybe it isn't for some other people, but I think we can turn to Dewey for this kind of very thick ethical vision of what democracy ought to look like. For him, it was an ethos. It wasn't just a set of institutions, and it wasn't just whatever outcome happened to be produced by those institutions. According to Dewey, we could very well be failing to live up to that ethos. And I think he articulated that very forcefully in his works. I actually share your concern that Dewey's meliorist optimism is only one among many different attitudes one might take and is incompatible with some forms of experience like consolation in certain works of art that are in fact incredibly enriching and very meaningful. And there's a part of this book where I talk about the philosophic mindset according to Dewey and compare it with other philosophic mindsets such as Stoicism, Hegelianism, all these different other existential attitudes, which Dewey rejects vehemently. He is convinced that pragmatic meliorist optimism is the way to go. And I say, well, aren't there times when acquiescence or just seeing oneself as part of a greater whole, where in situations where you cannot change anything, may be more appropriate? There are just times in life when those philosophies seem, in fact, more richer options under different circumstances. So I don't think, frankly, myself, I don't think a single philosophical existential attitude is ever going to be satisfactory. I think we have a rich repertoire of them in the philosophical tradition, and Dewey's is one. So thank you for this. Individuality and progress. I think those comments, both Philip and Michelle brought up these worries, and thank you for this forceful worry about the community and standing apart from community. To me, this criticism recalls Alan Ryan's worry about Dewey. Ryan says in his book, aren't there times when being the introspective non-joiner, the ethical individualist, may be better than being part of a group? This is a serious worry. Now, in Experience and Nature, Dewey talks about individualized minds, and he says that on his account, and I'm going to try to respond from his standpoint, every individual has a yearning to belong and also an irreducible uniqueness that marks them apart. And he says that actually it's not possible to ever overcome a sense of isolation, which is surprising for Dewey as somebody who's so emphasized community. He says that you can actually, there is a sense of isolation deep down that no community will ever erase, and a difference. But he thinks that the so-called social reformers are able to leverage that sense of reducible uniqueness, that difference, that standing apartness, to change society. So he would say that he would, in fact, and I think he did, admire figures like Socrates, who were unafraid to challenge the social matrix and say that they're the great benefactors of community. He did talk about these kinds of figures, and he said you can either conform to community when you encounter this tension, or you can try to remake it. And he was arguing for remaking. So I think for him, social immersion of the individual is not necessarily, and I think this maybe also relates to Philip's concerns, is not necessarily simply accepting the status quo, belonging by accepting. It is engaging with society. That's different. So not being like the Rousseauian solitary on an island, but actually seeking to make community life better, which arguably Socrates and all the other great figures you've cited tried to do. They were not isolationists. But doing so by leveraging that irreducible uniqueness. So I think Dewey did not advocate for agreement as much as engagement. I don't know if that answers your concerns, Philip, but on the notion of growth and the dialogue between individual and society and contributing to the larger whole, I think that this conception of individuality as something that is potentially a source of social progress because it can introduce challenge to the existing status quo is really central to Dewey's account. And that, I think, relates to Michelle's concerns. So thank you all for these rich comments.
Should we open it up to questions? Would you like that? And then you can all jump in as you desire. So questions from anybody? I have can I open with a question? Am I allowed? And then other people can go. I was interested in the sort of connections you drew between Dewey and then Rousseau, Plato. I thought there must be Aristotle somewhere in this story of flourishing and habits and developmental traits and adjustments and environmental adaptations and habit formation, all this stuff. I thought, but it did make me wonder what exactly the connection is of all this ethics and arts of growth and flourishing to the concept of democracy, because Rousseau spends a lot of his time criticizing the democratizing impulses of society as being antithetical to these kinds of values. And there's quite a lot of critiques of democratic impulses also in antiquity. So could you just tell me a little bit more about the link between this growing people and democracy? I know it's an enormous question, but it seemed to be right at the heart of your book, which I enjoyed very much, but I'd like to, if you could say a little more.
Thank you, Lydia, for this question. So let me talk a little bit about the sort of big conversation between Dewey, Plato, and Rousseau on this, and maybe that will answer the question. I don't know. The reason why I pick Plato and Rousseau specifically as interlocutors for Dewey is that they were his explicit interlocutors, and he was oftentimes talking about them. Now, Dewey is really inspired by Plato, which you might think is a little bit surprising because he's so vehement in rejecting so many Platonic theses. I don't know if Plato really believed in them himself, but anyway, he rejects the Platonic metaphysics, epistemology, and he, of course, disagrees with Plato very vehemently about democracy. But Dewey also calls Plato his favorite philosophic reading, a splendid and imperishable vision. Plato is his favorite philosopher. Why is Plato his favorite philosopher? Well, it's because Dewey sees Plato as a predecessor in the following sense. Plato, Dewey thinks, connects reflections on education and politics in a very special way, even in his critique of democracy, and especially in his critique of democracy. Now, Plato doesn't think that those are separate issues. You know, some people can worry about schooling, and some people can worry about politics, and maybe they relate a little bit. For him, for Plato, there are two sides to the question. One is, how can we prepare citizens? That's the more obvious one. But the even deeper one is, how do the social arrangements we inhabit shape us? And that's something that Dewey thinks Plato was the first to recognize, the depth of that question and the two sides of the equation. And so Dewey disagrees with Plato's assessment of the character shaping and educative quality of democracy. Plato thinks democratic characters will always be anarchical, inconstant, dilettantish, freedom-loving. And Dewey paints a fundamentally different portrait of the democratic character, also borrowing a bit from Rousseau on autonomy, but also disagreeing with some bits of the Rousseauian picture. So Dewey adds to the whole of portraits of democratic characters, which is started by Plato with a very uncharitable portrait, continued by Rousseau with a much more charitable one. And then I think Dewey gives us a very interesting new portrait, and I think it's worth engaging with.
That's where my question is. What exactly is Dewey's notion of this democratic character that sounds suddenly so positive, in contradistinction to the criticism of this democratic character earlier on?
Great,
I
thank you.
don't want
Yeah.
to dominate other people.
So it's a character that is constantly growing. And it's a character that's growing because it's open to the social, the sympathetic social engagement, open to learning from challenging experiences, open to the creative remaking of habits. So Dewey sees character as a collection of habits, and he thinks that you cannot have a perfect set of habits once and for all. And he thinks that you can have higher order skills that will allow you to keep reforming your habits in conversation with other human beings, such that your character grows ever richer as you engage with the world in a particular way. And he thinks that that's a flourishing way of life that's very different from the kind of uncharitable portrait drawn by Plato.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's worth saying here is that in the middle of this book, Democracy and Education, Dewey says something that strikes many people as utterly bizarre. He says, democracy isn't about votes, elections, or anything like that. It's actually about relations among people in a community. It's a shared way of life. And that, I think, is another way of answering Michel's worry. I mean, Michel was worried about how democracy relates to value, and on Dewey's account of value. Dewey's account of value, people who are proper ethical agents with the right sorts of ethical habits are people who can get inside other people's lives and minds and communicate with them and respond to them in ways that make for a harmony among them. So democracy is actually built right into the foundation of what I think of as Dewey's value theory, Dewey's ethics.
This is what worries me, though, about the development of people who are able to argue for change, progressive change. Seems like it has to require distancing in a way that maybe, I'm not saying he's not able to defend the distancing, but it's not on the surface in Dewey. It always feels like you have to dig deep, and it's almost like these are the people, but maybe they just are so. I mean, Hegel, worried about Socrates and his standing apart. And so maybe they are a problem. I don't know that very many philosophers are able to fully make sense of how their relationship to the whole develops and unfolds. But that's what worries me. You gave such a great answer, but it still feels like it's not the Dewey's answer right on the surface. It feels like you have to dig really far to get the agreement versus engagement. Beautiful distinction going. I mean, what the engagement looks like. That the content of that would be interesting for this discussion. But this is a great discussion.
Are there any questions?
Keep it fairly far.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. I want to ask a question, but before I ask the question, I want to preface it a little bit with a quick personal story. I discovered Dewey like 14 years ago, right here at Columbia. I had childhood trauma, adverse childhood trauma. I grew up with a caregiver, and I'm going over some of the things you said, Professor Kitcher, caregiver problem. I was uncertain in my life. I had precarity in my life. I was unstable. I was out of equilibrium, as you said. My body was out of equilibrium with my mind, and I wasn't embodied. I felt too much, but didn't feel enough, right? Or I felt too little, one or the other, emotionally. I went through these changes for years. And when the first time I read Dewey, he was the hardest guy to read in the world. You were right. He was torturous. But there was something about this thing called unity. And we talked about the Hegelian deposit and, but the unity was everywhere. The unity was between, body, brain, and mind. So you had neuroscience, he had biological matrices and cultural matrices, and everything was connected. And it's and just to say this, I had a therapist, my last therapist said to me, you don't do research, you do research. Because everything I read is about dealing with that trauma that I've experienced with. So for me personally, Dewey is very therapeutic. I find it extremely therapeutic, and I started to look for philosophers, philosophy of trauma. I think it was Sidney Hook who wrote about tragedy and others, right? And I started to see a relationship between the interpersonal neurobiologist who talks about trauma in terms of information processing and other problems, and the neuroscientists, and I started to see relationships with Dewey and many people. So it helped me in some ways to unify myself. He has in late work 13, he has an article about the unity of self that he gave to the physicians and surgeons up here. I work uptown in the Mailman School. But my question is, do you find Dewey therapeutic as I do?
Thank you so much for this question, and thank you for sharing your moving personal story. I really appreciate it. As a pragmatist, I think Dewey really hoped he would speak directly to people's concerns. Sometimes he speaks at a more abstract, higher level, and sometimes he speaks very directly, I think. And there are many passages, I actually think of some passages in Experience in Nature more so than Democracy in Education, where he talks about sort of the existential attitude, the pragmatic existential attitude that I personally find really uplifting and beautiful. So I think I perhaps can imagine where that's coming from and relate to that. So thank you for sharing that. And I don't know if
Sure. I'll stand up so the whole room can see me. Thank you for a great panel, and I really enjoyed reading your book as well. The question I had was about where you locate the normative force of Dewey's proposals. So Professor Kitcher mentioned that at the end of A Common Faith, Dewey is talking about the democratic ethos being grounded in a faith in the capacity for intelligence to better the lives of common people. And of course, that involves recognizing problems and sort of habitual adaptation to the environment as we cope. I wanted to ask you, is that the reason that you would give to someone who would detract from Dewey's philosophy, that simply the appeal, the normative force, lies in problem-solving capabilities? And if that's so, would you have anything to say to anyone who just kind of sticks their head in the sand, doesn't seek to adapt to problems, suffers from a prejudicial mindset, as Dewey would say? Yeah, I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that. Thank you.
Thank you for this great question. So, as I read Dewey, I think he has a much richer ethical account than just the problem-solving argument. He really has this, in fact, some people might object to this. This is actually where you could dig into his philosophy, but he really has this thick conception of human flourishing, and he thinks that he has a conception of human flourishing on which you can be most fully alive and have the richest experience possible. This is actually his phrase. If you develop the kind of open-minded growth mindset that sympathetically engages with other people in the community, actively trying to solve problems together, that he championed. He thinks that that will lead you to a richer life. And of course, people might reasonably disagree on this, but there is that thick conception. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, hi, I'm Nathan. Yeah, talking about like the human development in an individual, I'm just wondering like what's your interpretation on Dewey, or probably just your thinking on like an individual who lives in isolated displaced communities, or like people who live in under genocides, or where does this human development, human flourishing takes place in an individual who lives in this isolated violence or displaced communities? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. So Dewey didn't address that explicitly. He did champion trying to create communities in which human beings would be able to develop their individuality in conversation with a social matrix. And for him, that meant that the community had to be of a certain kind. It could not be a repressive totalitarian regime. That is very much not a Deweyan community. And going along with that would very much not constitute Deweyan growth. Deweyan growth only occurs under certain conditions where you really are free to engage in cooperative inquiry that is voluntary, open-ended, free, sympathetic, where there's public space for you to shape the conditions that you inhabit, the social matrix you inhabit. So that was, I mean, I come from Ukraine, which had a history of totalitarianism, and those conditions were absent for a lot of Ukraine's history. So I think he was very worried about totalitarianism, precisely, at least in part, because it undermined the capacity of individuals to shape the social structures they inhabit, which for him was so essential to what it means to be human, what it means to grow. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for that panel. It's been very insightful. I'd like to ask, is democratic nature of a society based upon like the foundation of its education, like its educational system? And if so, how should that educational system be built so that people could be encouraged to talk with one another, converse, sympathize, and like flourish pretty much?
Thank you for this question. Well, so this is essentially the subject of Dewey's democracy and education. And I will not try to summarize this in a sentence, but this is essentially the question Dewey tackles or tries to tackle. He doesn't fully tackle it. But I will give one example from Dewey's own context. Democracy and Education is 1916, so this was written over 100 years ago. But in his context, Dewey was arguing for creating educational system that would overcome the divisions, the various social divisions based on sex, class, and race. So really bringing people together from all walks of life so that they may learn to treat one another with dignity, respect, and sympathy, and communicate across the different social divides to overcome the bigger social divides that existed. So this is one concrete example of something he championed at the time. And of course, he didn't give us all the answers he wrote over 100 years ago. This is a very much a live question today, how we should improve education. But it's something he would say we need to think about.
I just want to add something quickly to that. I just had an interesting experience regarding Dewey this way. I came back about a week ago from having spent 2 weeks in China, and I was mostly in Nanjing, where Nanjing University, which is now called Southeastern University, was founded by a student of Dewey's here at Teachers College. And in fact, there remains a strong connection between this university and John Dewey and Teachers College, where a number of people have gotten their PhDs in education and went back to China. And I didn't realize that Dewey had spent 2 full years in China, 1919 to 1921, where he was revered. I gave over 100 lectures and was influential and instrumental in the change from the dynastic to the republic. I mean, yes, in 1949, with the rise of Mao and all that, he was kind of put in the trash bin, although I gather there's a certain revival of interest in him now. So if you go to museums there, you see Dewey is prominently displayed as being absolutely influential in bringing democracy and a republic to China after the dynastic, years and years, centuries of dynastic rule. So he's a very important guy there.
I even think that's why the core curriculum that's why the core curriculum eventually did try for a kind of Asian humanities course. I don't know what's happened to that course, but it was basically the influence of Dewey and the legacy. Ted DeBerry, I think he used to tell me.
And Monroe, I think, was another one, right? Yeah. Yeah, there's even, I just very quickly say, there's even in the old campus of Nanjing University where I got a tour, there's the central building is a sort of slightly smaller facsimile of Low Library. Yes, so it was put up as a kind of a tribute to Columbia. Yeah. I was very touched.
I want to go back to your question because I think it's a very good question. I think especially in a society like ours that's as polarized and divided today, we actually do need more educational steps than simply chucking people together in the classroom. So in some of my writings, I've suggested that from the time they're about 3 years old, kids should start to work out how they're going to do things together. You know, you do simple little exercises on how you're going to spend the next part of the lesson, and they get more and more complicated throughout the child's life and go on into adulthood. And you have to do them with more difficult things with more dissimilar people. I mean, that's trying to work towards that conception of democracy that Dewey defines in Democracy as Education. It's a shared way of life in which we try to interrelate to one another all the time. And, you know, that requires, as I think you see, a certain kind of training that is entirely lacking, especially in an educational system that's putting more and more emphasis on how well American children do on 2 subjects in worldwide tests. I mean, there have been movements in the history of American education to try to educate students to become better citizens. But at the moment, that seems to be completely lost sight of. And we need a Deweyan reform there.
Can I add one quick thing? One of the people, a woman named Diane Ravage, who I guess her book was just published by Columbia Press, used to be somebody celebrating all the testing and all, you know. She finally realized that it was it was narrowing down the range of capacities that could be developed by virtue. And maybe she's got a new book out, a new memoir. Maybe she's somebody who is, I think, actually part of a movement to try. Yes, great change. But she was one of the people saying, oh, give them all the tests. And of course, that's antithetical to what you need to do to make people grow and have flourishing lives. And I think Dewey, that's so glad that you're making us think about Dewey's legacy here, because it really is challenging everything about the current American system and showing us what's problematic about it. Another value of your book. So.
If I may, I'd like to just ask one very tiny question, maybe to end our session tonight. And that is, at one point in tonight's discussion, you said, as a scholar of Dewey, I do this, but I'm also an independent scholar. So a lot of the discussion tonight has been about Dewey for obvious reasons. But in terms of your growth, who else would you like to read in the future and write about as an independent scholar when you mature past John Dewey?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. In fact, I have been reading at Michelle Moody Adams's suggestion.
Not your prices.
No, but it's actually
my work for suggestion.
suggestion. Václav Havel's Power of the Powerless, reading and rereading it. I am, as I mentioned, I'm from Ukraine, and that totalitarian history is very much alive for me. And I am indeed inspired by those people who were able to stand up to power in this way. And so my next project on cultivating individuality that you were alluding to is really exploring that mindset, in fact. So that's next. Thank you.